Welcome to APLS Group's Huddle Up Overtime, inspiring professional conversations. Improve your personal and professional life in as little as 18 minutes. Here we cover the hottest topics with the hottest industry-leading experts for dynamic Q&As. This Vlogcast is what your career has been missing. Want even more insight? Join us every first and third Wednesday at our next free Huddle Up event on Zoom. Now it's time to get inspired.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to APLS Group's Huddle Up Overtime Vlogcast. If you're watching, thank you for joining us. I'm Paige Alunik, Vice President of Business Development at APLS Group. Our Huddle Up Overtime Vlogcast is meant to be an extension of our live virtual Huddle Up events. The Huddle Up community is a free public forum for inspiring professional conversations. We meet every first and third Wednesday, connecting on Zoom to hear about industry-leading guest speakers on topics to help us grow as people and professionals. We encourage you to join us. This new Overtime Vlogcast series is meant to keep the conversation going. Each episode, you'll hear from past and upcoming Huddle Up guest speakers for 18-minute Q&A sessions on the hottest business topics. Today, in episode number 2, we're welcoming Sharon Delaney McCloud, Director of Corporate Communications at UNC Health. Sharon is an Emmy-Award winning broadcaster, certified diversity executive, TedX speaker, adjunct professor, and executive coach who helps leaders and teams drive business results through strategic communications and professional development programs. Prior to her role as Director of Corporate Communications, Sharon led learning and development initiatives at Walk West and the Diversity Movement. She began her career as a television journalist, covering everything from NASA to politics to the Super Bowl at stations across the country. She's been featured in numerous publications, including Sheryl Sandberg's Option B digital platform, Thrive Global, Enterprising Women, and is co-author of the book, Keep Going, Memoirs of Strength, Courage, and Perseverance. In the community, Sharon serves on multiple boards of director and volunteers for the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, St. Baldrick's Foundation, and the American Heart Association. I'm excited to welcome Sharon Delaney McCloud to Huddle Up Overtime. Sharon, thanks for being here today.
Thank you. And thank you for the very nice, warm introduction.
Absolutely. So you were APLS Group's Huddle Up guest speaker in January of 2022, and your topic was Virtual Privilege Walk, using your privilege to become an ally in your organization and beyond. Can you tell our listeners what exactly is a privilege walk?
Sure. It's something that I had never heard about until about 2 years ago. Just to back up just a second so that our listeners can understand that the privilege walk is really an incredible interactive exercise that is born out of the work that's being done across our country and really around the world around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in 2018, I started the journey to becoming a certified diversity executive. And it's really been an incredible path so far. There is no ending. And I think that's important to recognize for anyone who's doing this kind of work and is interested in learning more about how to create more inclusive cultures at their workplace, is that it's an ongoing journey. There is no end point because it's constantly evolving. And so I participated in my first virtual privilege walk. It was right after the pandemic shut us down, and I attended a virtual conference. And when I did the virtual privilege walk, I was so taken aback about my learnings and understanding my own biases and things that I thought were privilege and not privilege. And it really, for most of the attendees of this particular conference, that was their biggest takeaway. And they responded in very large ways saying, I have not stopped thinking about that exercise because it was so impactful. And so the way the virtual privilege walk goes is, in the old days, before everything was virtual, it would be done in person. And if you could imagine a large conference room, and you would have all the attendees stand up, and the facilitator would begin the exercise by asking a set of questions. And for each yes, you would take a step forward. If it was not a yes, you would just stand still. And then at the end of the exercise, the room looked very different. You'd have a number of people way at the front of the room and other people who had not moved very many steps based on their answer. Now, transitioning this to the virtual world, I think it's actually provides even more psychological safety, because for some of the questions, there can be an element of shame or embarrassment that you either had a whole lot of privilege or you didn't have much at all. And there can be different emotions associated with each. And so the virtual privilege walk allows a sense of anonymity, and people don't necessarily have to share what their number is at the end. But then those who are willing to share it, it fosters and begins some really interesting conversations.
Wow, that I saw you do the exercise on our Huddle Up, which was virtual, and so to hear you talk about it in person, that definitely gives it a much different dynamic and much more powerful impact. You're right, yeah. And one of the things that struck me was the nature of the type of questions that you asked in the exercise. Can you give our listeners a flavor of what some of those questions are?
Absolutely. I'll begin with this preface that the notion of privilege is so much broader than we think. There's a lot of stereotypical kinds of things of privilege that it's associated with wealth or being a certain gender or a certain race. And certainly there is privilege associated with those things, but it is so much broader than that. And so I'll give you a couple of examples of the questions, just some of the easy ones getting started when you're doing a privilege walk. For example, and this is the way it would work, you basically take out a piece of paper and you add +1 if there's a yes to each of these questions. And if it's not a yes, you just don't add 1. And then at the end, we add it all together. But the first question is, if you are right-handed, add 1. Who thinks about these things? But you know what, Paige, it doesn't happen so much nowadays, but for some of our parents and grandparents, if they were left-handed, they were forced to use their right hand. That was just the way it was. School teachers would force, and parents and grandparents were told that you must use your right hand. Can you imagine?
Yeah,
some of the things are given nowadays. Let me give you another example. If there were more than 50 books in your home when you were growing up, add 1. For some people, that was a given. For others, it was not. If there were people who worked for your family to provide household assistance, such as cooks, gardeners, or nannies, add 1. That would be something stereotypical that somebody might think of as privilege. If you went to school speaking the primary language in which courses were taught, add 1. I think people tend to spend a lot of time with others who look and sound a lot like they do or similar backgrounds, but that is not the way of the real world. If your family never had to move because they couldn't afford the rent, add 1. It turns out that a lot of the privilege walk questions do err to the side of whether there was poverty in your childhood or in your early years or not. But then other times it wasn't. If there was anybody in your family who ever experienced substance abuse, and that could include alcoholism or other addictions, and that knows no race, background, sex, or economic status. And so a lot of these questions touch everyone. And so at the end of the 42 questions, we added up, and everybody has a very unique reaction and a very personal reaction to it. Some people are willing to share what that number is. And as the facilitator, I would then ask, and I'll show you here, just because for those of you who are watching this, in addition to people listening to it, I have reflection questions that I ask, and people who feel comfortable can share it in a chat. or I can unmute people. But what would be some privileges that stood out to you during the exercise? And Paige, let me go ahead and ask you.
Well, you did touch on one about the left and right handed, but I also, one of the ones that I think there was a question about, was there someone in your family that supported you? I can't remember exactly what that question was, but it was starting to paint that picture of, sure, you can ask the questions about that have to do with how much money your family has to be able to provide things for you, food, shelter. But do you, even if you don't have those things, is there still someone there who's going to support you and move you along and teach you how to have a positive outlook in when things aren't necessarily going your way?
And not everybody has that.
Yes.
I think when you live in your own little world, you just assume everyone else has a similar upbringing, and that is so far from the truth. Was there a particular challenge or obstacle that stood out to you, Paige, that you may not have thought about as being a challenge?
For me, I think one of the things that was clear to me is that most of the things that I didn't give myself a +1 on were things related to my gender, the fact that I'm a woman, and how that sometimes can be limiting in our culture. And it may also be based on my age as well. So I think that was something that was sort of an aha moment for me.
Yes. And that's, another, and I think I might have shared the story of a friend of mine who did the privilege walk. And on the surface, you might think that he wouldn't have scored very high because he was the child of immigrants. His parents are from India, so he has dark skin. And we know that that can also hold people back, not only in our country, but around the world. But the next fact is he's blind. So you would think, my goodness, how could he feel privileged? He can't see anything. But he scored in the high 30s because even though he has a physical disability and he is a minority in our country, he had so many other things that supported him growing up that he actually feels very privileged. And so that was, I think, a really interesting point to notate. The other thing is, that we think about in what ways were sacrifices made for you. What sacrifice? Like, I know my parents sacrificed greatly for me, and that is a huge privilege that not everybody gets.
Absolutely. You're right. I remember when you did the exercise in Huddle Up, one of the participants said he needed to call his parents and say thank you to them.
That's exactly right. And there are a lot of people who come away from this exercise with a lot of feelings and a lot of emotion, and that is natural and that's okay. And yeah, there were people when I've done this in person who came up afterwards, literally with tears in their eyes, saying, I just had not thought about all the things that my parents gave up in order for me to have the chance to succeed. And so understanding that privilege and having that sense of gratitude really can help change your personhood and how you approach things. And there's some other things that I wanted to talk about today, Paige, that I think would be really helpful. When you come away from a privilege walk exercise like this, then what? What's next? Right? So what can you do with this information, this new learnings about yourself to make change and to make impact in your world, whether it's at your work, your family, a nonprofit you might work with, your church family, whatever it might be. And so some of those things that we want to think about is how to be an ally, and being a good ally starts with mindset. And some of those things that maybe you go into a conversation that normally might go sideways, but if you go into that conversation with positive intent, that can change the whole dynamic of that interaction. And with that positive intent, you're moving closer to being an ally with this person who might sometimes be an adversary. And so thinking about, all right, so if you start that conversation with positive intent, think about it as a dialogue and not a debate. Today, everyone is all into debates. Nobody's on the same side of anything. We're so polarized, right?
Yeah, we're so polarized. We're coming around the other side and meeting them coming back. So yes, you're exactly right. You're right. Mindset really is part of the key, and trying to determine what your goal and intent is. Absolutely.
And sometimes it's also just being truly curious. We all have different points of view that come from our different life experiences. And if we would just close our mouth long enough to ask, to listen, ask a question, and then stop talking and actively listen to try and gain understanding of the other person's point of view. And just because you are trying to understand their point of view does not mean you're agreeing with it. So that's the other thing. I think a lot of people can get closer to that allyship goal if you realize that just by listening and understanding doesn't mean you're agreeing. It just means that you are seeking to understand. And by doing that, by being more open and transparent, you're also going to build a more trusted relationship. And then also within this work, when you're talking about really difficult conversations and dicey kinds of subject matter, you're going to mess up, but that's okay. You're going to make a mistake. You're going to say the wrong thing. That's okay. Quickly apologize and say, I didn't mean for it to come out like that. Here's what I actually meant. And can we talk about it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So after you've taken this exercise into organizations, what kind of things are you seeing? What's the impact and the effect that it's having?
What we're actually asking people to do, like, what is the action we want for within 30 days, but hopefully within the first few days after someone does an exercise like this, is go find someone else who also participated and start a conversation and say, you know what, I'd like to download some of my thoughts about what went on, and I'd like to hear your viewpoint as well. And then you could take it to the next level. Could you gather the people who participated in this exercise and say, why don't we have a 30-day download? What have you done in the last 30 days to change the way you think about your coworkers? And how can we use our privilege to become better colleagues? And so there are steps that we can take, but someone has to carry that. Someone has to carry that. And so maybe you have a 30-day meeting of the same people who have participated, and let's say, all right, let's have some conversations. Let's explore further about what our reactions are from it. And some people do this virtual exercise within an employee resource group. And so then they have like the after meeting, kind of like what we're doing now, the after the huddle up. Like, let's not let that one-time experience go by the wayside and never think about it again. How can we use what we learned about ourselves to impact each other positively? And just starter questions that, can you explain what you meant by when you said XYZ? And using some of these kinds of things to continue the conversations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm hearing a lot of passion in your voice as you talk about this, Sharon. What really excites you about this kind of work?
What excites me, honestly, Paige, is for everyone to realize that if we can very deliberately come to a table and a conversation, knowing that we all have different points of view, we all have different opinions and life experiences, and that we're not the same, and that's okay. That it is what those differences are, that if we can work together, we can solve problems better. Whatever that problem is, whether it's a social problem, healthcare problems, workplace problems. There's so many racial problems that if we could all learn to come to the table to speak to each other with civility, rather than turning it into a debate, but rather keeping it as a dialogue and seeking to understand, not necessarily agree, but to understand, I think we could solve problems so much better.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if people wanted to know more about this topic, where would you recommend that they look?
I would recommend that you go to where I have done all of my learning and my consulting work, and that's with the diversity movement. It's thediversitymovement.com. We have so many resources on our website, downloadable guides, all kinds of blog posts. We have podcasts, so much content that can help you in your learning journey.
Thank you. Absolutely. I love that. It's nice to know where to go to get some more information. Sharon, this is a fascinating topic, and I know from having taken the exercise myself that it definitely has a profound impact. And I thank you for joining me today on APLS Group's Huddle Up Overtime.
Thank you so much, Paige.
For those of you listening, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.